Thank you to those of you who have joined us. Hi, and welcome to our virtual panel, where we'll discuss EU regulatory changes and their global implications in the context of ESG. I'm your moderator, Stina Warnstam-Drolet. I'm head of sustainability at Oxford Analytica, where I lead our sustainability advisory work, including our ESG monitor service. For those of you who don't know, Oxford Analytica is part of the bigger Fiscal Note family, and this event is brought to you by Fiscal Note ESG and EU Issue Tracker. EU Issue Tracker monitors policy changes in the EU. They provide targeted alerts and forward-looking analysis from their Brussels-based team. Fiscal Note ESG solutions help organizations take charge of their entire ESG strategy through technology and expertise. This includes getting started with strategic insights to benchmarking, audit-ready reporting, and ultimately providing or proving rather a return on investment on their sustainability initiatives. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. The first thing to say is that we will be recording this session and we'll share that recording with you by email later on. The second thing is that we want this to be an interactive conversation, not just between our panelists, but also between those of you who have joined us. So we do encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the window, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. Now, joining our conversation today are Justine Renal, Axel Hellman. Axel will be speaking in a personal capacity, and also Melissa Gibson, all of whom bring a wealth of experience in the ESG policy and reporting space. Before I ask our panelists to introduce themselves, let me just say a few words on the topic we'll be discussing today. There is no doubt that the EU has been a global leader in driving the green transition and sustainability initiatives. We see organizations around the world look to Europe for the latest regulatory trends, latest green policy initiatives. Recently, we've seen new sustainability-related rules coming out of the EU that will have, by design, global implications as they apply not just to EU companies, but also to non-EU companies, whether that is disclosure requirements under the CSRD, or reporting on human rights and environmental impacts across supply chains under the EU's proposed Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Lately, we've also seen signs that the EU or the EU's ability to maintain its green leadership is being tested, and particularly when it comes to green technology. Last month, we saw the Commission announce its Green Deal Industrial Plan, which is designed to boost investments in green technologies. This, of course, was the EU's response to the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, that was announced by the US government last year. So far, we've seen that IRA subsidies appear to be encouraging major businesses to relocate investments to the United States, especially in areas like battery production. In this context, there are a number of questions that arise. For example, will the EU's response be enough to maintain its green industry competitiveness? What are those key EU proposals that companies, including global companies, should be looking out for? How will they impact global companies, and how will they influence practices across other regions, including the US? And importantly, what can companies do to best prepare for those new sustainability requirements? I'm delighted to have an excellent panel here to help us address these and other questions. So without further ado, let me introduce them to you now. Justine, can I start with you?
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon to all. Thank you for having me. So my name is Justine Renard, and I'm the environment analyst of EU Issue Tracker. And so EU Issue Tracker, as you said, is a regulatory monitoring service based in Brussels. We cover 13 policy areas, and we help clients to identify the risks and the opportunities from EU policy initiatives.
Thank you. Axel, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you very much, Stina. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Axel Hellman, and I'm a policy advisor on the European Parliament's Committee for Environment. I work for Jessica Polfjord, who's a Swedish member of the EPP group. She's also a deputy coordinator on the committee. As you mentioned, we're witnessing a huge political and regulatory shift in the Union tied to sustainability. So I'm very, very happy to be here today to get a chance to discuss it all with you.
Thank you, Axel. Melissa?
Good day, everyone. I'm Melissa Gibson. I'm an ESG and Climate Strategy Associate with Fiscal Note ESG Solutions, and I work with our Equilibrium product that helps to just, clear up all of those ESG data problems.
Thank you, Melissa, and thanks everyone for those introductions. So let's get straight to the discussions. And perhaps, Justine, can I turn to you first? We've seen the number of regulatory initiatives and disclosure requirements related to ESG increasing significantly over the last 5 years. What do you think are some of those main drivers for this increase, and why are they becoming prevalent globally?
Yes, so, well, I think the main driver is the state of play of the situation of the world. I mean, there are so many reports showing, for instance, that climate change needs to be tackled. And then there is also really a willingness from consumers to have companies which are responsible and to buy products which are environmental friendly and which are not, for instance, coming from work from children. So there is really, I think for me, this willingness from consumers, and also there's a state of play of the situation, which makes that regulators are taking initiatives to solve the problems. And in 2019, the European Commission has presented the European Green Deal, and I think it was really a milestone in the area. From there, a lot of initiatives stem, and it also set major goals. For instance, it set the goals to for Europe to become an the first climate neutral continent by 2050. It also set the goal to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030. So there are really huge goals that it is trying to reach. And after this, a lot of initiative started to originate from this. So I think it was really the main element. And I think it's worth mentioning that in the EU area, there will be the parliament election next year. And it will really, because of this, the Commission, I think, will really want to present all of the initiatives in the coming weeks and the coming months, so that they can be finalized before the next parliamentary election and before the Commission is renewed.
Thank you, Justine. And we'll get to some of those proposals in a moment. But before we do, let me just turn to Axel and get his thoughts on the drivers, and are there other factors in addition to what Justine said that are at play here?
Well, thank you for the question. I think Justine gave a very good overview of the changes that we're seeing. But as you pointed to, I think all of this that's happening at the moment, all the political initiatives you're seeing and all the specific legislative proposals that we're now dealing with here in the Union, they all flow from the Green Deal, which was something that the European Commission came out with very early on during this mandate. And it's a big document. It touches on almost all sectors and aspects of sort of Union policy. But at the heart of it, what I think it's really trying to do is to answer the very straightforward question, which is to say, how does Europe set ambitious targets for the environment and climate? And how do we deliver on those goals? And how do we do that in a way that preserves the competitiveness of European industry? And I just think that's worth remembering, because from the beginning, this has been presented as a growth strategy. So the new sustainable growth strategy European Union. I think Justine also mentioned that we're seeing this push from consumers that they want to be able to make more informed and sustainable choices. And I would just add to that we're also seeing this huge shift from European businesses. They really want to make the transition. They want to be front runners. They want to be sustainable. I have the privilege to travel around and meet a lot of these companies. And it is true that a lot of the push comes from us on the political side. But the way we see it, getting this transition done in a good way is also key to securing the competitiveness of European businesses in the long term.
Thank you, Axel. You mentioned some of those key stakeholders there and just into consumers, governments, businesses themselves. What about the investment community? What role do they play in driving these requirements forward?
Do you want me to start, or?
Sure.
I mean, from where I'm sitting, they're key. If we look at a lot of the initiatives that we're seeing all across Europe, and there's hundreds of them, right? Some really interesting are new battery factories. We're seeing them in Germany. We're seeing in my home country, Sweden. We're seeing new projects to produce fossil-free steel. It's happening on all sort of levels through the European economy. Those changes and that transition is dependent on securing financing, right? And so I think that investors are really key to unlocking the potential of the clean growth of European businesses. It's very straightforward.
Thank you, Axel. Justine, did you want to add something there?
Yes, and notably, I think the Commission also, so indeed, investors are crucial actors, and European institutions want to fight what we call greenwashing. So we can mention the taxonomy regulation. They really want to make that investment made are the ones which are the most sustainable. So there is really this willingness from the institutions, indeed.
Perfect, thank you. Well, why don't we get into the details of some of these initiatives? And Justine, maybe I can come back to you and ask you to give us an overview of those key EU proposals in the context of ESG that companies around the world should be watching. Perhaps you can give us a few examples.
Sure, absolutely. So there are a lot of them. I mean, I don't think we will have enough time to go through all of them today, really not. But there are some important that I can tackle myself right now. We can mention the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which has already been discussed by every institution, which entered into force in January, and which will start to apply in the coming month from 2025, let's say. So the idea is that EU companies will have to publish regular reports on their social and environmental risk, and those reports will have to indicate how their activities impact people and the environment. The goal of this directive is also to apply to a large set of companies. In the past, those reporting requirements apply to less than 12,000 companies in the world, and today it will be widened to 50,000 companies around. So it's really a substantial increase. But of course, it will be only the biggest companies will be impacted and not the SMEs. So they will have to report on really various areas, such as, so they will have to report on their business models, on their activities related to anti-corruption, but also on the diversity of their board, and also on social and employment aspects. And as I said, the first reports will have to come out in 2025 based on the business activities conducted in 2024. An important point will be the Commission adoption of the reporting standards this year in June. So this is something that we will have to monitor. And we have a second important directive. This one is still ongoing. The name is quite similar, so be careful not to mix it. The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence. The work is still ongoing. The Parliament is still working on its negotiating position. The goal is to foster sustainable and responsible corporate behavior throughout the value chain. So this is an important aspect. And companies will be required to identify how their activities will impact human rights and the environment. But in addition to this, they will be required to prevent or even mitigate those activities. So this is really like companies will have to be involved in mitigating their impacts. Again, for this one, only the biggest companies will be targeted, and SMEs will not be included in the scope of the directive. Maybe I will let the floor for mentioning other type of initiatives.
Thank you, Justine. Perhaps before that, we do have a question that came in related to what you just mentioned. And the question is about what's the threshold in terms of who has to disclose sustainability reporting in Europe? I think that can probably apply to both of those directives. But starting with the CSRD, what's the threshold?
So the CSRD will be, so which companies are included in the scope of the directive? It will be all listed companies, and also large companies, which are, there are three, let's say, aspects, and they have to exceed at least two of the following criteria. So companies with more than 250 employees, with a balance sheet over 20 million euros, and with a net turnover of over 40 million euros as well. For the other one, the CSDD, there are different groups of companies. Let's say, not sure. So let's say the biggest one, the big group of biggest companies targeted by the directive are the one with more than 500 employees and a turnover over 150 million euros. So they are the ones that will have to comply with stricter requirements.
Thank you, Justine. Axel, what are some of those other initiatives that companies need to keep an eye on?
Well, I fully agree with Justine that there's a lot to keep track on, so I don't think that we can cover everything here. I think she pointed out what are probably some of the key bills that I think investors in particular need to follow, because those are the ones that entail a lot of sort of reporting and data requirements. From my side, I guess I can add a few of the proposals that I see really affecting European businesses, or indeed multilateral or international businesses that want to operate on the European market. We're coming out of a period now where we have been dealing with a big portion of the really key sort of climate files, those that really set the broader ambition for Europe's climate goals. So we have, for example, or nearly have, an agreement on the ETS, which is the EU sort of cap and trade system, setting a price on carbon. I have been working on something called the effort sharing regulation, which sets national binding emission reduction targets for member states. And we're also having an ongoing debate on combustion engine cars, which you may have heard about recently. I guess after that, there's a new wave of legislation coming out, which is more specifically aimed at products. And that primarily falls under the umbrella of what we call the circular economy package. So really, how do you transition the economy or sort of the system of consumer goods to more sustainable patterns? And there are a lot of proposals under that sort of circular economy umbrella, but I thought I could just highlight a few of them. So at the moment, we're dealing with something called the eco-design proposal. And I would say that this one is really important because effectively what it does or will do is to set specific criteria for pretty much every single product that's going to be placed on the EU market to make sure that they follow certain sustainability criteria. So if you're a business and you're producing or selling products within the EU, this will be really key to keep an eye on. And we're negotiating that one at the moment. Also yesterday, some proposals came out. One is on so-called green claims. And it is intended to be a kind of certification scheme. So if a business here in Europe says that they are climate neutral, or that they are sustainable, or that they have X number of, a certain percentage of recycled material in their product, this will be, I guess, a sort of verification scheme to ensure that they are actually living up to those claims. So going back to what Justine said earlier about, consumers want to know, what products they are buying. I think this is one to keep an eye on. And then we also have a really big proposal on packaging and packaging waste, which is super detailed. It's really broad. I'm looking into it at the moment. But at the core, I guess what it's trying to do is to really look at how we can reduce the amount of waste coming out of packaging. So again, there are a lot of proposals that are being negotiated at the moment or that are just being presented. But I think those are some of the key ones that if you're an investor or if you're a business interested in the European market, you should really keep an eye on.
Thank you, Axel. In the context of the circular economy, I wondered if I could bring in Melissa here and ask her about one of the proposals that I think we saw some news on this week, which is the right to repair. So Melissa, could you tell us a bit about this one and why it's important?
Yeah, absolutely. Right to repair is absolutely like an essential piece of establishing that circular economy. The ultimate goal of right to repair measures is, reduce greenhouse gases and lower waste, especially since electronics are the fastest growing source of waste in the EU. Right to repair regulations include information on right to repair during a legal guarantee period, whether or not consumers have the right to repair after the guarantee period, or the right to repair these items themselves. These regulations will require, spare parts and repair manuals to be available to consumers and or, professional repairers for a specific amount of time. Right to repair advocates hope that legislation will also address the cost of the right to repair, as costly professional repair is the reason why consumers often replace instead of repairing. As it currently stands, right to repair includes rules for items like servers and data storage products, washing machines, dishwashers, fridges, electronic displays like monitors and TVs and lamps. Further recently proposed legislation includes provisions on requirements to repair within legal guarantee and increased rights for consumers to repair beyond that legal guarantee. These include producers' obligations, a matchmaking network of repairers based on locality and quality standards. And recently, an agreement was found on battery regulation, which will require manufacturers to move to batteries that are changeable by consumers and try to move away from single battery disposable devices. We've all had a phone that you can't take the battery out of yourself. So it should come into effect in 2026 or 2027. Additionally, the eco-design measures for small devices like smartphones and tablets have been finalized. This means that spare parts will be available to consumers with a larger range available to professional repairers for 7 years. Repair instructions will be required to be available for repairers for 5 years after a product is taken off the market, but that will not take effect for a couple years. And it already has crossed the pond too. In the US, a right to repair law was already passed in New York State at the end of 2022. This will only apply to products made after the 1st of July in 2023 and not sold to businesses in business to government or business to business contracts. And over half of US states have introduced right to repair legislation. And these regulations are just really important because, as I said, it's an essential part of that circular economy, but it's also it's a way to open consumers up and inform them about some of these issues and get into those just like daily ESG and environmental patterns.
Thank you, Melissa. And let me stay on that topic for a bit and let's talk a bit more about those global implications of these EU regulations. What will be the international impact? Melissa, you've mentioned already a couple of examples. I wondered if you could talk a bit more about how these regulations will influence standards and practices across regions, and perhaps sitting in the US, Melissa, I'd love your perspective there on not just right to repair, but across all the initiatives. What impact are you seeing?
Absolutely. So on the basic level, EU ESG regulations are some of the most strict in the world. Just look at the CSRD reporting requirements compared to the SEC reporting requirements in the US. Not only does the CSRD require many more reporting metrics on environmental and social factors, but also more prescriptive data collection methodologies like double materiality, scope 3 reporting, and due diligence requirements. US internationally based companies that have EU-based subsidiaries that fall within the scope of CSRD reporting will be required to follow the CSRD requirements, though on a later timeframe than EU-based companies. So there's long been a pattern of the most stringent regulations cascading into other regions within reason. Regions that have close economic ties, like the EU and the US, will often come to mirror each other's regulations on purpose or not. I see an example of this mirrored with the international seatbelt regulations of the last century. So most of Europe passed seatbelt requirements in the 1970s and in some form or another, while the fight to pass seatbelt laws in the US lasted for much of the 80s and early 90s, with some states taking the fight even later. I see ESG regulations following that same pattern. I predict that the inevitable growing pains from the stricter regulations in the EU will inform regulation in other regions. Regulation can drive innovation, and the lessons learned from enacting the CSRD and other EU measures can pave the way for smoother adoption of ESG regulations across other regions. I do want to point out that it can go both ways. So you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act earlier, and that what that means for companies that want to take advantage of these tax incentives. There already have been some companies that have moved to the US to take advantage of those, with facilities, in battery manufacturing especially. When it comes down to it, the Inflation Reduction Act can inspire some healthy economic competition between the EU and the US, which we have a long history of. Companies that take advantage of these incentives and programs like this, and also the newly announced temporary crisis and transition framework, can place themselves in a much more competitive economic place in their regions and industries.
That's great. Thank you, Melissa. Axel, can I bring you back in here and get your thoughts on, from an EU perspective, what impact globally do you think what you guys are working on will have?
Sure. And in one way, I think Melissa is probably better situated to describe what that impact looks like, but I can at least give you a sense of what the intention from over here is, which is exactly this, right? I mean, we are, of course, regulating the European market, but the intention is very often to set a precedent that others that then can follow. And I think that goes back to what I said in the beginning about the Green Deal being a growth strategy. I think the mindset here, at least for a lot of people, is that, look, if we're going to make this right, if we're going to deliver on these environment and climate targets, and for others to want to follow that, they need to be able to look at Europe and say, hey, they're doing it pretty well. They still have thriving companies, and they still have a lot of jobs, and they have a forward-looking economy. They have preserved their competitiveness while delivering on those goals. So I think while we're sometimes very focused on specific legislation here, naturally, the intention is always to sort of set a precedent that others, should they wish to do so, could follow. There's one, I think, example that I think is quite telling. You may have heard of the proposal that was negotiated not long ago, called the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is often presented as a sort of carbon tax. So this is essentially, I mentioned earlier, the ETS as being the instrument for putting a price on carbon within Europe. Well, this is sort of a mirror proposal that is intended to put a price on carbon for goods that we import into the Union. Now, it's often sort of described as being a carbon tax, but the intention has always been to, through this mechanism, actually have other nations and other actors follow in our footsteps. And I think you can see it in the way that the proposal is designed, which is to say, well, if you have similar measures in place in your market, so take America for an example, if you have measures in place in America that puts a price on target, so sustainability legislation, if you will, you will kind of deduct that price from this tax. So the agreement isn't necessarily to actually put a tax on it and collect money. No, the idea is to set a precedent that others will then follow to kind of even out the playing field also globally. And I think that is just a case in point to describe how with a lot of these proposals that we're talking about, sure, we are one market, we're a really big market and we can have a lot of impact here in Europe, but you know, it's always great if other markets want to follow suit.
Thank you, Axel. Just staying on that, the topic of the CBAM, I wondered if you could give us your sort of personal viewpoint on how likely are countries, non-EU countries, to follow those footsteps. And perhaps I'd love to hear Melissa's thoughts also from a US perspective on the outlook there.
Well, again, the intention has sort of always been to set a precedent for others, and you know, I think you mentioned the new legislation in the United States. I think the design is very different, and you know, there's no secret that there are very differing opinions here in Europe on the IRA proposal. That said, you know, it is one step to actually set higher, more ambitious environmental targets also in the US market. And you know, just that aspect of it is something that is very broadly welcomed here. So I think that if we look around, there's a growing understanding too that Europe can also leverage its international partnerships, its trade relationships, to actually push for others to recognize the value of sort of setting ambitious environmental targets as well.
Yeah, I would just point out that at least from outside of the EU regulation moves at the speed of light, and the US is not necessarily in a place where we're mirroring that. And I know at least for what you're talking about with carbon right now, a lot of companies in the US are relying more on carbon credits and carbon accounting, which carbon credits, there are opinions both ways on them, but I think that following the EU's example is still going to be a way for the US to find a way that these regulations will work for the states, because a lot of these regulations are federal, but many are state by state too, and it just really comes down to what regulations will be able to be controlled on a federal level and what just will be just so far down the pipeline that it's not necessarily going to be workable at the moment.
And I think one example, Stina, is if you look at the relationship between the EU and the United Kingdom. Clearly, the UK is not a member of the EU anymore. And as you all know, there's been a lot of sort of controversy surrounding that relationship. But I would point out one thing, which is, I think great, which is that if you look at the climate environment policy, there's still a very strong sense of coordination between the UK and the EU. And I think that a lot of the steps that the EU is taking, we see that being duplicated also in the United Kingdom, also in countries such as Norway, clearly also not a member of the EU, but with very sort of strong ties to that. And I think, once again, that shows both the normative power, but also the opportunities that come with having this huge sort of internal market that the EU sits on.
Thank you both. Very quickly, before we move to the next section, I wondered if you could just comment a bit on this healthy competition that Melissa referred to over green tech between the US and the EU. How can the EU maintain its green industrial competitiveness in this space? Maybe Justine, I can bring you back in, and I'd love your short thoughts on this before we move to some of the more specific implications for companies.
Sure. Well, this is what the EU has recently presented, as you mentioned in the beginning. The Green Deal Industrial Plan is really the plan for the EU to remain competitive, especially in response to the American Inflation Reduction Act. It sets clear targets for the EU in terms of manufacturing capacity for net zero technologies. So to have the capacity really to reach the goals of the Green Deal, so becoming a climate neutral continent. And also, so there are two main acts that stem from this Green Deal Industrial Plan, the Net Zero Industry Act and the Critical Raw Material Act. So it's really to have the capacity to produce technologies to reduce our environmental footprint and fight global warming, and also to have the capacity to extract raw material and to not depend on third countries and to not over depend on third countries, because the situation we are currently in is, I think, worrying. There are few suppliers of raw material currently, whom some of them are China, countries in Africa, and as you really want to push for having more extraction capacity within the territory, but also to push for having a better relationship with those countries. And I think an important point here related to the social aspect of it is that the European Union wants to develop those relationships to be able to extract raw material. But there is also in the proposal, there is also a mention of social aspects of it and environmental aspect of it. This should not be detrimental to human rights, such as, for instance, child labor. We know that child are involved in the extraction of raw material in certain countries. So really those regulations and the Green Deal Industrial Plan are really a great, I mean, they aim at least at keeping up with the Americans.
Thank you, Justine. So let's talk a bit more about the implications for companies. And perhaps we can start on a sectoral level. And if I may, Justine, I'll come back to you immediately and ask you, how do you think the changes that we've discussed will affect specific industries? So, for example, finance or energy, agriculture, or manufacturing. Are there some industries that will be more affected than others?
That's actually a good question. I think the answer is that there are no industry, no sector will not be impacted by some of the measures. All of them somehow, whether it is directly or indirectly, will be impacted by some measure or by some upcoming measure. For instance, we can think about the agricultural sector. We think about the financial sector, as I mentioned, with the taxonomy regulation. There are further regulation, one that will come out in June this year, related to ESG rating and sustainability risk in credit rating, for instance. As Axel mentioned earlier, companies which are selling consumer goods are also really impacted by regulations. The European Union will want to really decrease packaging waste, to make products more environmental friendly. We have also the ban of products coming from deforestation. So cocoa or wood will not be imported. I mean, it will not be allowed anymore to export to the EU goods such as cocoa and wood, which stem from deforestation. So really, every sector can be impacted. The chemical sector, we haven't mentioned this one as well, but there will be a regulation, the revision of the REACH regulation, hopefully, probably, let's say, which will be presented at the end of the year. But I think what we can say is that some regulation as well will mostly impact large companies. For SMEs, there will always be some specific provisions for them. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive only impacts large companies which have the means to do this reporting. And I think it's also important to know that those impacts, I mean, every sector is impacted well, but it can be negative impact in the sense that companies will need to adapt for sure, and they should already start to adapt. But there are some great opportunities. The mining industries will be developed also within the EU, or the circular economy will really be developed within the next month and years. So there are really great opportunities, I think, I hope, for companies within the next month and years.
Great, thank you, Justine. I think that is a key thing to point out, that it's not just about risks, but there are a lot of opportunities involved as well. Now, Melissa, perhaps I can turn to you and get your thoughts on how companies can ensure they comply with these regulations, and what are those risks of non-compliance, and perhaps ask you also to talk a bit more about those opportunities involved as well.
Yeah, so the most important thing here is like early and thorough preparation. Being proactive is key to ensuring that the transition to following these new regulations is done in time for the required start date. There's like certainly a number of growing pains with stricter regulations, but having that strategic game plan will help you prepare for any of those issues or risks that might arise in the meantime. If you don't already have employees working on ESG reporting, it may be time to consider assigning the work to existing employees with the required expertise, or hiring new people, or using ESG software like Equilibrium. It's massively beneficial to have specific employees devoted to ESG measures, as in scope companies will need to pay constant attention to these updates. Like this week's temporary crisis and transition framework, and yesterday's proposed directive of green claims that works to expose greenwashing. That these things happen so fast, like I said, that you really need people that have have their nose to the ground on these ESG issues. Also, something to keep in mind is that if your company is involved with upstream or downstream activities that may be significant to your business-to-business customers, like Scope 3 emissions, expect to receive data requests, as the CSRD requires Scope 3 reporting. B2B vendors will need to add fielding Scope 3 data requests to their vendor services. As for the risks, I would say the initial draft of the CSRD set forth those risks of noncompliance to include fines, cease and desist letters, and publicized naming and shaming by the regulating body. However, the final drafts drop these binding penalties, and instead putting the onus of deciding penalties on the EU member states themselves. Each member state will be deciding what penalties, if any, to apply in the case of noncompliance. Germany has instituted criminal risks that companies could fall into. So it just really needs to be paid attention. That's why it's vital to have those employees or ESG services that you use that can help guide you on these ESG issues. I'd say beyond regulatory risks of noncompliance, there's also the corporating and marketing risks. The role of ESG, right to repair, and these other terms as trending phrases can't be ignored. Companies need to stay competitive while interacting with these regulations. If your biggest competitors are investing in their ESG reporting and initiatives, but you are not, you lose that edge with a growing number of consumers, private and corporate, that care about ESG issues. Consumers care more about these environmental issues and will be spending in accordance with that. It's not only consumers you need to consider too. Investors are increasingly interested in companies that show that they are agile in the ESG space. And as for the benefits and opportunities of that, I'd say, at this point, because I'm an ESG professional, I believe in it, I'd say they're boundless. And I think that, it is because ESG is gaining traction and so many more people are interested in these issues, that if you can show that you are forward and you are up to speed on your ESG issues, you will not, you do have that competitive edge, and you won't be kind of left in the dust in a few years when people that are showing non-compliance with these issues are kind of reaping the punishments for it.
Thank you, Melissa. I just want to have a reminder to our audience at this point that we will be coming to your questions a little later on, in a few minutes, in fact, and do submit your questions, and we'll try our very best to tackle them. Before doing that, Axel, can I go to you now? Justine, she mentioned SMEs and how they are to some extent shielded from these new regulations. I wondered if you could talk a bit more about how they will be impacted nonetheless, and how they can adapt as smaller companies, including startups, to these new requirements.
Sure. I'll just start by making the point that whenever we deal with a proposal, so whenever we are negotiating a new law or proposing amendments or changes to a proposal, this is something that is always being discussed. What are the opportunities or challenges for especially the minor businesses to comply with these new regulations? And that takes different forms of expression, right? So sometimes there's a clear SME exemption. So we heard, both Justine and Melissa talk earlier about how some of these reporting proposals only target the big corporations. And then if you're a small or a medium-sized company, you're exempted from these rules. But another key priority that my boss and her colleagues are very often pushing for is, to just make the laws that we're working on as easy to comprehend as possible. I think Melissa gave made the good point earlier that regulation can be a great driver for innovation. In some cases, it can also be the opposite. It can be sort of impeding innovation. And sometimes innovation works faster than regulation. So I think in general, the responsibility of policymakers here is to set clear frameworks and not sort of overly prescriptive and too detailed regulatory rules. So, I mean, something that you very often hear being discussed is, what is the regulatory burden this law imposes? What we want to do is to enable innovation through these new rules, but in order to do that, it needs to be sort of broad, it needs to be clear, and it needs to be easy to implement. Specifically on sort of what smaller businesses can do, I don't think I'm the sort of best person to speak to that. I would only make one important point, which is to businesses, whether you're a big corporation or if you're a smaller enterprise, which is to get involved on all various levels of policy making. From where I'm sitting, me and my boss, we meet regularly with businesses. We meet with citizens too. We meet with environmental organizations, but we also meet with trade unions and with businesses. And they want to make the points that, this is how we see these proposals. So don't be afraid to kind of engage with the policymaking. Everyone else is doing it. That's what I usually tell, especially Swedish businesses. So you should do it too, because it's important that we sort of on the policymaking side hear from the business community too, because ultimately for a lot of these proposals, they will be kind of tip of the spear. They will be the ones that are actually implementing these rules in practice. So that would just be my key message to the audience.
Thank you, Axel. Staying on the topic of engagement, Melissa, perhaps I could come back to you and ask how companies can best communicate their ESG practices with their stakeholders now, consumers, customers, their own employees, in fact. How can they build that trust and credibility in this area?
Yeah, so this is where data is really vital. Making sure your data is available to consumers and investors, employees, in a really digestible format. I spoke about, preparation and proactivity before, and it's an essential piece of building that trust and credibility. Stakeholders of all kinds are increasingly wary of, greenwashing and false claims. Devoting that time to verify, track, share your data will pay off in the long run. You'll see that many companies have pages on their sites dedicated to sharing their ESG metrics and disclosures and environmental work. Making that information available to external sources just helps build that trust. You can use ESG tools to help you, collaborate that data, to make it digestible, beautiful, trackable. It's also really helpful to have it, in your press releases, on your social media accounts, especially since those younger generations are the ones who use those social media accounts, are the ones who have increased spending power, and who are going to be more interested in these issues, as the years go along. It's just really vital to making sure that you are avoiding greenwashing and you are being open, because even if a piece of data might not be where you want it to be, consumers know. They're going to know if it's greenwashing or not, especially with this new regulations, disclosure on green claims. It's just really important to spend that time to be thorough.
Great advice. Thank you, Melissa. Now we have about 10 minutes left, and I do want to get to some more of those audience questions. And we have one that is asking, let me just see, whether we can talk about the upcoming flag reporting requirement changes. Is that something that either of you are familiar with and so would like to address?
Not me, I'm afraid.
I'm not either, and I don't know what flag actually stands for. Justine, is that something that you've come across?
Unfortunately not. I just can say that, I guess the person who has a question knows, but I just can say that they are professionally expected to be presented in May. But unfortunately, I don't have more expertise on this.
We gave it a shot. Thank you. So another question I have here is perhaps going back to you, Justine. How can, as a company, how can they keep track of the regulations that apply to their specific organization and their specific role? And perhaps, Melissa, this is one for you as well. I'd love your thoughts. Perhaps starting with you, Justine.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is an interesting question because indeed, as Melissa said, we are in a fast-paced environment, and regulations are proposed or debated every day. And this is really crucial, I think, to have the tools, the proper tools really to monitor everything. Because if first companies have the information, then they will be able to analyze them and act on them. But having this information is not as simple as we think, in my opinion. I mean, I work for EU Issue Tracker, and we do provide this platform, which really is a monitoring tool on different policy areas, 13 of them. So it's really quite broad. And I think this type of tool would be really useful to have everything at once, all the information to be updated in a really swift manner. And all companies can also have a dedicated team, obviously, but this is indeed really a job to do, to have this monitoring, collect the information, and then depending on what is your area of activities, act on this information and understanding what will happen, what can I do. And time here, I think, is an important aspect. What I'm saying is that if the Commission presents a proposal, it might be too late for you if you want, for instance, to work before, not only to comply with the regulation, but also to lobby and to maybe influence policymakers. Then you really need to have all the information before proposals are presented, before Parliament and Council are discussing it. During can be useful as well, but before is also useful. So monitoring is really crucial, I think.
Thank you. Melissa, go ahead.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I would just say the same. Monitoring is vital, and like I said earlier, having those employees or ESG consultants that can update you on these issues. It is hard for someone who might not have that ESG background to just be able to look through these regulations. Just myself, I was looking through some of those new ones yesterday. There's disclosure on green claims, and it can be a lot to digest at once if you're not that familiar with the field. Like, bringing in those people is really vital. And I will say, maybe less of a deep answer too, is you can't discount the benefit of subscribing to ESG newsletters. I know that I wake up at 20 in my inbox every morning, but that's the way that I learn about some of these things. And it really is, it's worth your time if you're trying to spend more of your workday getting used to these ESG regulations.
Thank you, Melissa. Another question is, what should I keep in mind about the ESG backlash as it comes to creating and executing my ESG strategy? Melissa, maybe I can come back to you on this question.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. I spoke about trending terms earlier in the positive, but it goes both ways. Right now, ESG is a bit of a hot button term for some people. I've heard of companies avoiding using ESG in favor of using the blanket term sustainability, or even throwing back to the terminology that's popular in companies that work in the built environment. People, planet, prosperity, the 3 Ps. One thing to keep in mind when potentially shying away from ESG is that generally each time a major survey about sentiments on sustainability and ESG and environmental issues has been run in recent years, the percentage of people who care about these issues has steadily grown. Though the voices working against ESG or doubting it may be loud, the majority of your consumers and investors likely want to see ESG reporting and initiatives. To quote one of my teammates, ESG is here. It's better for the planet and everyone on it. And as time goes on, as ESG gets more popular, you will thank yourself for having spent the time to devote yourself to your ESG initiatives.
Thank you, Melissa. Perhaps one final question. I know we're almost out of time. To what extent do you think the EU's environmental ambitions, and particularly the circular economy push that we've talked about, and Axel, maybe I could come to you on this. To what extent do you think that could be weakened in the face of industry lobbying? We talked about engagement and lobbying. Is that a risk in this context?
Thank you. I don't see it at risk of being weakened. I think that from where I sit, there has been a very strong majority here in the Parliament, but also among member states, of the new targets that the EU has set up. That is the sort of overall CO2 emission reduction targets. But we also have the sort of the plethora of specific environmental goals. And we're now actually seeing over the last 2 years, I would say, and I addressed some of the specifics earlier, the Union not only being able to set high targets, but actually delivering on them. So at the moment, I don't see the risk of them being weakened. I think what we always want to have is a rigorous debate with stakeholders. As I said earlier, everything from environmental organizations to businesses, but ultimately, it's up for the policymakers to have the integrity to move forward with proposals that are delivering on the targets that they have accepted. So I hope that answers your question. I think we're seeing steps forward at the moment and not backwards.
Thank you, Axel. Yes, it does. We are unfortunately out of time. I'm seeing 1 minute left. So at this point, I want to say to our audience, thank you for those questions that we haven't answered. We'll follow up with you after the panel. And to say a big thank you to our panelists for your time and your willingness to share. And again, for the audience for joining us. Really appreciate taking time out of your day to join us. If you have enjoyed this conversation, we do have another great webinar coming up, and that's on April the 20th, where we'll be looking at the business case for ESG. And there will be a link where you can register on our website, and we'll try and add it here as well. But with that, thank you again for joining us, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.